Hey everyone! Welcome to this beginner workshop for SideFX's project GROT. This project was about how a team of 5 can quickly create a really detailed scene in Unreal Engine by using procedural tools. In this workshop we'll go into how I made these tools that were used to create these runes right here. As you can see in this image, there's a lot going on, and so this workshop will also be split into 2 parts. The first part will focus on the fracturing tool that turns a blockout into a detailed ruin. And then in the second part, we'll go into the flesh tools that I created to help decorate the scene. But before we get into it, maybe a quick introduction. My name's Julian, I'm a tech artist from Austria. I worked in Archviz for 4 years where I made tools like this, and this office table generator that procedurally places clutter so that artists don't have to manually do it themselves. Right now I'm working at Cloud Imperium Games, where I help make procedural modeling tools such as our Maelstrom destruction system. And in my free time, I also write a tech art blog on everything Houdini related, like tutorials and breakdown of personal projects. So today I'll first talk about existing fracturing tools in Houdini that you can just use out of the box, and we'll get the job done most of the time. I'll explain the technical foundation behind these fracturing systems, which is what we'll be using to create our own fracturing tool. After we've made our fracturing tool, I also want to touch on non-organic fracturing, because fracturing is usually something associated with breaking things into rock, wood, or glass, but I want to take a moment to show how we can cut things into clear geometric shapes as well. So what is fracturing? Simply put, you take a shape and then you break it into pieces. The amount and shape of these pieces is up to you, but some common use cases are breaking things to make them look like concrete, glass, or wood. Luckily, there is already a tool from SideFX called RBD Material Fracture that does the job. So here's what it looks like with the concrete settings, the glass settings, and with wood. This is the way to fracture things if you're not looking for something too complicated. How does it work? It's actually a simple concept known as the Voronoi diagram, which is the foundation of most fracturing tools out there, be it in Houdini, Blender, or Unreal Engine. To illustrate how Voronoi diagrams work, I have this cool video from Wikipedia. Basically, a bunch of points are scattered, and each of these grow outwards in a circle at the same rate, and they stop once they meet each other. These resulting shapes are called Voronoi sites, and if you look closely, you can see that the borders of each site are exactly halfway between each point. So it looks complicated, but it actually follows very simple rules. This is the basis of the fracturing tool that I made for Project GROT. Because while the RBD Material Fracture node works great for most cases, you sometimes might want very specific controls for your fracturing that are not readily available. Today I want to show you how to make your own custom fracturing tool while showcasing some of the features of the tool that I made. Alright, let's get into Houdini. The first thing you want to do whenever you want to create geometry is you want to drop down a geometry node and double click on it, and now you can see we're in the geometry context. So now that we're in the geometry context, we have access to a bunch of different nodes, such as the Voronoi fracture that I mentioned earlier. And this will be the basis for our fracturing tool. With any tool that you make, you first need something to test it on, and in this case I'm going to use the pig head. And just to make it a bit less overwhelming, I'm going to remove the shader so we just have a very neutral looking geometry. Okay, if I plug it in though in the fracture node, you see that not really anything is happening, and that is because we also need points for our Voronoi cells. To get these points, there are many different ways we can go about it. The way that I like to do it is I like to get an ISO offset node, and what this does is it will create a fog-like volume from whatever you're inputting. It's hard to see right now what is actually in there, but if I increase the uniform sampling divisions, we can see more clearly that this is in fact our pig head, but now displayed as a volume. And the reason why I want this as a volume is because by using a scatter node on a volume, we can apply the points, we can scatter the points inside this volume. If we don't do this, just to see as a comparison, we will only scatter the points on the surface of the pig head. Now I'll plug this in. It might be kind of hard to tell what exactly is going on, and what I like to do whenever I'm working on destruction-related tasks is I like to get the exploded view node. And what this node does is, well, as the name suggests, it explodes our mesh, meaning it moves all the pieces around in space. And this lets us peek inside the destruction that we just created. This is really helpful whenever you're debugging or just want to see the visual quality of whatever you're looking at. To enable a wireframe mode, you can press W while hovering over the viewport with your mouse, which can help you inspect the insides. In this case, it's a bit too many pieces for me right now. I'm just gonna turn this down to something like, let's say 200 pieces. I think that should be a good number. And before we continue, I first want to talk about the topic of, okay, how can we make our shards longer, right? Because this is something that that I've shown in the video earlier. So if you recall from earlier, one thing that I mentioned was that Voronoi expands uniformly in all directions at the same time. And what that means though for us is that each piece, you can see that even though they look kind of random, they all have a kind of uniform scale in all directions, meaning they're not really longer in one direction than another. They try to have an evenly spaced shape in all axes. So how can we get around that and for instance, make them longer along the y-axis? The short answer is we cheat. But how do we cheat? The easiest way we can do that is by getting a transform node and simply scaling the result up. So let's just get our parameters over here and let's scale it up by, let's say by 3 in the y-axis. So this might look a bit weird right now, but let's focus on the shards themselves. So now we can see that the shards are in fact longer in the y-axis. But of course, this is not the end result that we want, because we still want the pig head to look as it did in the beginning. Well, the cool thing is we can simply squish it earlier to balance out the stretching. So let's get another transform and just put it right after the pig head and connect this up. And then because I scaled this up by 3, we can just scale it up by 1 divided by 3. So now we have this squished pig head that gets fractured, and then it gets scaled up again. So now it looks like normal, but our shards are now the same kind of proportions that we had earlier when we had it stretched up. And I just want to mention also, this is just in a y-axis. We could also do this in the x-axis, the z-axis, or you could even rotate the pig head to get any kind of directionality that you're looking for. So this already looks much better than earlier, but it's still a bit too uniform. And us humans are really good at detecting patterns. So how can we break up that pattern? There's a really cool node called RBD Cluster that helps us with that. So let's just plug that in and we can immediately see an effect. So what is going on here? Well, as the name suggests, it basically takes a bunch of these pieces and clusters them, groups them together to help break up this uniformity. And a way to visualize this and make it a bit clearer what's going on is by using a visualizer. To enable a visualizer, you can press the I button and then press the attribute that you're looking for. In this case, is the name attribute. Now that we have visualized the name attribute, we can see which pieces belong together. So even though they used to be different, they're now grouped together and also will behave as if they're one piece. In this RBD cluster node, we have different parameters to affect how they're clustered together. So for instance, there's the detach ratio that randomly removes pieces from the cluster, which is really helpful to add even more breakup to this pattern, which I'm going to disable now just for demonstration purposes. For the overall larger chunks to control them, we can play around with the size parameter. You can see that it has 3 values because it goes for each axis. In my case, I just want to move them all at the same time. So I'm just going to write 0.5 in each parameter. Okay, so this helps us already to bring some of them together, and you can see we have way more interesting looking shapes than before. It tricks our brain a bit more to not see the pattern. And then on top of that, I'm gonna add in a bit more of this detach ratio. Now we have some cool looking rocks. Okay, so the next thing I would like to go over is how can we now remove certain parts of this fractured model? Because the thing is, we now have this fractured model, and there's a lot of stuff that we can do. We could, for instance, use this in a simulation to break it apart, but this is not really what we were about in the project. For us, it was more to aid a tool that can create this weathering effect of an old ruin. And I want to have a static mesh at the end. So in the video that you saw earlier, I painted the damage. What I would like to show now is a bit more of an easier version of that by using the bounds of an object to drive a selection that will then remove the pieces. So to do that, let's just get a group node and plug the RBD cluster in the left input, and we can get a sphere to drive the bounding object. So oh yeah, let me just move the sphere really quick, move it over here. Yeah, maybe here. That looks good. And to use the sphere as a bounding object, we can have to change the group type to points, and we go to keep in bounding regions, and then we change it to bounding object. And now we can see that all the points that are within this blue sphere are now selected. But the thing is, if I were to now just blast these points, we wouldn't really be getting what we're looking for. As you can see, it's removing each individual point, not the entire piece. So if we look closer, we can see that there are a lot of points that are not fully covering an entire piece. So we have these half-blasted pieces. And this is not what we want. We would want either the entire piece or nothing from the piece to be blasted. So how can we do that? There's a really cool thing that I would like to show you as well, which is called packing an object. And to do that, we can get a pack node. You can now see that when we connect that, first off, the blast disappears, we lose the color, and it looks a bit different. And also, if I enable the display point preview, we can see that we don't even see any points. What's going on here? Well, the way you can imagine a pack node is you can compare it, for instance, to a zip file in Windows or on your Mac. Whereas a normal folder with images and videos inside is a lot more complex. It has a larger file size, and it's more difficult to work with it. Whereas a zip file condenses everything into one packed folder. So if we turn on wireframe mode on this pig head, we can see that there is actually a point, but only exactly one point in the middle of this pig head. And that is because now Houdini is treating this entire model as one primitive, a packed primitive. And that means that it's way faster to calculate, and it's also easier to handle when we're doing operations down the line. The thing is, I don't want one packed primitive for the entire thing. I would want one packed primitive per piece, so that we can then simply detect a piece in a binary yes/no group. And to enable that, all we have to do is go over here in our packed primitive node and enable the name attribute toggle. And now you can see that we have a bunch of points in there, and our deletion is working as intended. And the reason why this is happening now is because if we go over this again, our packed primitive puts each piece, and that also means the clusters of the pieces. So each cluster is being packed into one packed primitive. Then our group node because we're now dealing with with points that represent the entire object. If just one point is selected, the entire piece is selected, but not a half piece like here. And then if we blast it, we blast all the pieces. And now when we move our sphere around, so if I go over here and enable my gizmo and move the sphere around, we can see that it's dynamically deleting the pieces that are intersecting with our sphere. So this is already pretty cool, but I'm missing one thing that I saw earlier in the material fracture node, and that is the detail. So if we look closely, we can see that while we have these interesting shapes now, they're pretty low poly looking and have pretty much no detail going on in there. So to get that back, I want to show you a different node called the RBD Interior Detail node. And once we enable the display flag, you can see that it's erroring. It's not working anymore. And why is that? Well, the reason is because we're still dealing with a packed primitive. And the thing is, while packed primitives are really good for these simple operations like selecting, deleting, or adding attributes or things like that, once we want to directly work with the geometry again, we need to unpack it. So in the same sense that I would have to unzip my folder to be able to access the photos and videos in my folder, I now need to unpack my model to be able to work with individual polygons. And to do that, we just get an unpack node and just drop that in front of the RBD Interior Detail node. And now we can see it works again. Let me just disable the point preview. So there's not really much going on at this point, but we can get a better hint at what's going on by enabling our smooth wire shaded view. And if you look closely, you can see that there are some new subdivisions being added, but it's very subtle. And the reason for that is because the detail size parameter of our RBD Interior Detail node is set a bit too high for what we are looking for. So if you just slowly decrease this, be careful not to do it too far because this grows exponentially the amount of polygons. So if we go to something like 0.01, or maybe that's too high, let's go to 0.025. Yeah, this looks like a good density. We can now see that we have a lot more detail, but it's not really giving me this interesting noise that we had earlier. And to get that, we can just play around with the noise amplitude slider, and then we can see we have more what we're looking for. So this already looks really cool and rock-like. The last thing I would like to do is to combine all of these pieces together into one homogeneous piece. And there's a really cool node for that also called Voxel Mesh, Labs Voxel Mesh. And if we just plug that in, it's going to turn it into a bit of a blob, and it's maybe not what you're looking for, but that's also because the division size is set a bit too largely. So if we also decrease this, and again, be careful with the setting, if we decrease this to something like 0.01, we now have a really detailed mesh. So what it does is it turns our entire mesh, all of these different chunks, it turns them into a volume, and then it turns that volume again into a polygon. And the cool thing about this is that it makes everything into one continuous static mesh, not into all these different pieces. So now we don't have to worry about what's inside and all these things, and also the density of polygons is going to be the same. Just one thing that you should maybe look out for is, well, you can see that there's a lot of parts that don't really require a lot of detail, like this underside of the pig, but still it has the same amount of polygon density as the more detailed areas of it. And there's a helpful slider here, this adaptivity slider, that can help us with that. So if we just increase this a little bit, you can see that we're immediately removing a bunch of polygons that we don't need. Even just setting it to something like 0.01 already does a great job. And we can compare that by hovering over, by pressing the I button over our remesh grid. we can see that with adaptivity, we have 98,000 primitives or polygons, and without it, we have 187,000. So almost half are removed just by adding a little bit of adaptivity. Okay, so this is already a pretty well-rounded tool, but I want to also take this moment to talk about a part of our work that you may not be so familiar with. So let's just imagine we are the end user, the artist that's going to be using this tool, right? So now we have this incredibly cool tool that makes any kind of mesh into a detailed fractured mesh. And the detail is the cool part about it, but it can also become a problem. So for instance, let's say I want to make changes to this, and I have this sphere and I now want to move it around. You can see that as I'm moving it around, suddenly it becomes very stuttering. Earlier when we were just testing it out, it was behaving in real time and we got immediate feedback, but now it's really slow and a bit annoying to use. And this is where the factor of quality of life or user experience comes into play. And what I want to focus on quickly here is that we turn this this chain of events into an optional feature that the user can turn on or off. So instead of having this always follow along in this chain, we just put it to the side and we are getting a switch node. Let's just plug both of these results in. I'm going to plug in the unpack and I'm going to plug in the remesh grid. And what the switch node does is, well, as the name kind of suggests, it switches between two different results. And you can see that when I select it, I first get the unpack, but when I switch it over to the next number, we can see that I'm now getting my remesh grid result. So basically, if I switch to 0, and I go back to my sphere, and I play around with it, it's in real time. And once I'm happy with it, I can go back and I can turn this on. And now I have my detail. This is a cool tool. Well, it's not really a tool just yet, right? Because so far I had to keep jumping between one node and another and keep changing all these parameters by hand. But that's not really what Houdini is about. At the end, we want to have maybe 4 or 5 handy parameters in one unified, centralized user interface. And to do that, I would like to get the Null Node. If you're not familiar with a Null Node, well, it doesn't really do anything. In fact, it doesn't do anything. It's just a blank canvas, and we can do anything we like with it. This is not the only way that you can add parameters to your tools, but this is an easy way that I like to do it whenever I'm sketching and still figuring out what the tool is going to be down the line. To help me identify what this is, I'm going to call it params for parameters. And now over here on my blank parameter canvas, I can go over here to this little gear icon and then go to the first setting where it says Edit Parameter Interface. And now I'm getting this little window that has a lot of building blocks on the left side and this empty space to the right of it. On the left side, we see different kinds of parameters like float, integer, texts, files. We can load files even, colors, all kinds of different things. In this video, I only want to focus on 3 of them, which is a float, an integer, and a toggle. So let's just grab these 3. So all of them are called label, and I'm going to quickly rename them so we can see better what each is. So this is a toggle. And what they do is, a toggle basically is just an on-off switch for any kind of feature that we want. An integer snaps between full numbers with nothing in between. And a float allows us to get any number, any decimal point number between these integers. And what I would like to control this tool is basically, for instance, I would like to be able to change the amount of pieces of my fracture, the length of these pieces, the clustering, and then a switch to enable or disable my high detail mode that I've created down here. So one thing that you can do, or something that I like to do sometimes, is when I already kind of know what I'm gonna do, I usually like to prepare my sliders in advance. And this can also aid as a kind of a to-do list when you're working on your tool. You can do that at any time. You don't have to do it at all, but for me, sometimes it can help so I can keep seeing what is ahead of me. So in this case, I'm gonna call this detail mode because this is what I want for the detail mode. The integer I'm gonna call pieces amount. My float I'm gonna call pieces length. Oh yeah, make sure to spell everything correctly because this is case sensitive in case you're coding or using expressions. Then I'm gonna get the cluster scale. And the random detach ratio. Okay, I think this is already a good selection of sliders. And one thing that maybe seems a bit minor right now, but that I want to touch on just in case, is that when I pressed apply, all these sliders appeared with a value of 0. And this is maybe not a problem because, you know, you can set any value that you want later on, but it might become a potential problem in case you're giving this to someone you're working with or using this tool in Unreal Engine, because this 0 value is the default value of our slider. So you can imagine that if you're using your tool, you're loading it up in Unreal, and now the pieces amount slider is set to 0, well, this would mean that it creates 0 pieces, and then your tool would fail. And this can be a bit confusing, and I've run into many situations in the past where people were trying to use a tool but then said, hey, it's not working. Well, and that is often because the default slider is just at an odd value. It doesn't mean that the tool is not working, it just means that maybe you forgot to set some good defaults. So this is something that you should go over. Not only the defaults, but also the range of what you're trying to achieve. So in this case, for the pieces amount, I would like a minimum of 50 pieces and maybe up to 250. And to set the default value, we can go to channels and then set it from 0 to, let's say, 100. So now we can see when I press apply, it immediately snaps to 100. We can still move it around, and you can also shoot over, by the way. You can go over the 250 limit that we set if you want to, but by default, the cap is 250. For the pieces length, I think I'm gonna go, well, you never want to reach 0 with something like a length, so I'm gonna do something like 0.01 up to 5. For the cluster scale, same reason. Let's not go to 0, let's go to 0.1 and then up to 10. For the cluster scale, I guess it really depends on what you're looking for. In our case, because the ruins were like 50 meters tall, a scale of 10 is not that huge, but if you want to destroy props or something, then maybe this is a bit overkill. And for the random detach ratio, because the slider that I'm trying to affect has a setting, has a range from 0 to 1, I also want to keep this range from 0 to 1. Okay, I think we got a pretty good setup. Oh yeah, let's not forget the default values. So pieces length, I'm gonna do this maybe 0.5. Cluster scale, also 0.5. It's totally up to you. This is just like personal preference. Okay, now I think we have some good parameters. Now we just need to link them, because as you can see, if I move them around, nothing is happening, and that's because they're not really linked to anything yet. So let's see where we can add these things. For instance, let's start with the switch with the detail mode. Okay, I'm gonna go over to my detail mode in my parms window and press right click, copy parameter, go to my switch, and then press right click, paste relative reference. And it already works. The reason why, by the way, is because a toggle underneath is a Boolean, meaning it goes between 1 and 0. And this is exactly what we need in our case for this switch. We simply want a 0 or a 1. If what you're looking for is not so much a quality, no quality feature, but something like low, medium, high quality, you can do that as well, but then you just need to change your parameter to support more than 0 and 1. Next, I'm going to go to the cluster and get the detach ratio and the size parameter. So let's just get the cluster scale, copy that. And in my case, as I mentioned earlier, I want the same scale for all 3 axes, but if you want to, you can change this, of course, to have 1 per axis. So now you can see when I play around with my cluster scale, I get these larger or these smaller pieces in one handy parameter. Now for the detach ratio, also copy and paste. Then for the pieces length, we need to do something a bit more, we need to think a bit more about what we want to do. Because because as you remember, we first need to squish it down and then stretch it out in the same amount all the time. So how can we do that? Well, I guess the easiest way would be that first we focus on the stretching. Let's get our length and then copy and paste that in the transform node here in the y value of the scale. And then what we can do, we can go back to our transform node, and then we can just pass on this parameter right here where it says 1 divided by 3. We just replace the 3 with the value we had. And here we go. And now we basically have our fracture tool. Okay, before we end off this workshop, I would just like to show you something called non-organic fracturing. Because the thing is, so far we've mostly been covering organic fractures, such as creating concrete, wood, or glass. But fracturing doesn't always have to mean breaking, as in relying on random chance to get a result. We can also do it very precisely and geometrically, or non-organically. So I've prepared some examples that you can look at and see for yourself. So first off, I want to show you how we can cut a cube into many smaller cubes, for instance. Looking back to what we've done earlier, we've used the scatter node in a volume to randomly place points that will cut the shape into smaller pieces. In this case, instead of the scatter, I've used the points from volume node. And this one is pretty cool because it basically does the same thing, but instead of placing them randomly, they're being placed in a structured, regular way in a 3D volume. And the reason why I want to show that is because when you have the points arranged in a regular way, the fractured pieces will also be arranged in a regular way. So when I explode this, you can see I have this perfect assortment of little cubes. And as I change this points from volume, for instance by changing the density, we can see that the cubes are also changing accordingly. And if I play with the jitter seed, for instance, the jitter scale, for instance, so making it more and more random, we can see that the cubes are also becoming more and more random. And now we have basically arrived at something that resembles what we've done until this point. But if I go back, we get more and more structure. And that means we can use the Voronoi fracture not only as a breaking tool, but also as a slicing tool. For instance, if we take another cube here and we get a line that has the points arranged in a diagonal way, we can use this to slice the cube like a slice tool. So if I rotate, if I move around and scale around this line, we can see that everything is being sliced accordingly. This is something that you could use, for instance, in motion graphics, or I don't know, or if you want to make a tool that makes things look like they're cut. And this non-organic fracturing approach is what has helped me also to make the Berlin sidewalk that I've shown earlier. The way that it works is basically I get any kind of surface, and then I have two different points from volume nodes, each set to 0.5, to a point separation value of 0.5, meaning 50 centimeters, because that is the measurement of one of these tiles. But then I have a second one also with an offset of 0.25 meters, because they're offset diagonally. Then I merge these two, and then I plug them into a Voronoi fracture. And this is how we then get the very iconic Berlin sidewalk pattern. And the cool thing is, because now I have the points derived from the points from volume SOPs, it is dynamic. So if I increase my sidewalk, it keeps updating and keeps adding new tiles. I can even use a completely different shape, such as this heart, and my system will adapt accordingly. If you're curious about these non-organic fracturing approaches, I would highly recommend you to check out Akira Saito's work. He is basically a genius when it comes to non-organic fracturing for costumes, weapons, spaceships, and he's also done a talk specifically about this topic for side effects in the past. Well, that's it for part 1, and if you're interested in seeing how I made the flesh tools, I'll see you in part 2. Thank you for watching, and see you around.